College football nerds, we are here talking Florida and Oklahoma, a really interesting bowl matchup, which is funny because a lot of people have been arguing with us that outside the playoffs nothing matters. RJ, we're coming for you too on that one. Josh is with me. We're going to get nerdy, get into the numbers. As you know, we're going to have a computer model, but y'all, this is the first time we're really going out of conference. We don't have those interconnecting data points. So it might be a little bit weird. We'll explain it. But before we get into the model, we're just going to talk a little bit about this game. We're going to settle in for a minute, have a little conversation about these two teams. Want to remind y'all, as always, it's the postseason, so should already be liked and subscribed. But if you haven't, it helps us out a lot. Another thing, and Josh pointed this out on Twitter last week, we don't do Patreon or any of the sponsorships or things like that. What we do ask you, if you really want to help this channel out, is to share us on Twitter, share us on your home forum or message board, share us on Facebook. It really helps us out. It gets those YouTube algorithm juices flowing and people find us. All right, Josh, enough with the intro. We were talking in the setup before we hit record, and one of the main things that we're really frustrated about is how Kyle Pitts is not playing in this game. He opted out, which is his, certainly his right. But in terms of being football fans and seeing what he's done all year, we would have loved to have seen him in this matchup, just because of the challenges that him in the lineup presents for the defense. Now, this is not to denigrate the rest of that offensive unit, because obviously Kyle Trask is a first-round quarterback, and there's some really good wide receivers. Grimes and Toney are great on this team. But I want you to talk a little bit about how Kyle Pitts, adding him into the fold, is not just adding a great player and it makes you that much better. Adding him dramatically changes how defenses defend this Florida offense, and it makes Florida a lot greater than the sum of its parts offensively. Why don't you get into that to get us started?
Kyle Pitts was a unique player in that he had the ability to play as an inline tight end and be a physical blocker and a downfield receiver. I think he's going to play receiver at the next level, frankly. And I've been sort of saying this. I said it before the SEC championship to Daniel, and I'll repeat it now. I think there are some serious comps to guys like Alshon Jeffrey or even somebody like Megatron. Guys his size at his speed are uncommon, and his agility is very underrated. But they use his size a lot, and I think people underestimate how many times in the short yardage run game and in the receiver screen game and things like that they leverage his physicality, and he was able to move guys downfield. That creates matchup problems. And for most of the season, teams really struggled defending Florida because you either went overly heavy and you got burned deep, or you went overly light and you got burned short. For example, Alabama, we thought that they should play Florida in dime and they kind of play small. They actually spent most of that game playing with Pitts as if he was a tight end, and they got hit one-on-one over and over again, where the slot or safety players couldn't handle Pitts. And I think you have to treat him as a true receiver with a safety over the top. Again, I think he's going to be an potentially NFL number one receiver. Without him in the fold, though, Florida's a lot more predictable. And the big thing is you can match personnel with Florida and kind of know what you're getting. With Pitts on the field, if you went small, Florida would tend to then put him as an inline tight end, and you really would end up struggling because you had a size mismatch in the box. And if you went too big, then they put him wide. And there was sort of a lose-lose situation. Without him, and we saw this with LSU, you can play man coverage on their receivers and get, the matchups that you actually want to get. Florida is less able to dictate coverage. We talked a lot in some of their prior games. One of the things they love to do is they would put Pitts in as a tight end, and you'd be in your, base personnel or nickel personnel, depending if they were 3 or 4 wide. And then they put Pitts in isolation on one side of the field or the other. And what that does is it draws one of your boundary corners over to Pitts. But if the corner is on Pitts and there are, let's say, 3 receivers on the field, that only leaves 2 corners in a nickel. So you'd end up with the slot receiver generally and a linebacker, and that's where they'd like to put Toney. And Toney would just go off because Toney is going to smoke a linebacker 100% of the time. It's that kind of thing that goes away. That's what makes them a lot easier to defend. It's not just how awesome he is as a player, which is true, but it affects everything on the field, and it makes it much harder for Florida to get the matchups they want with the other receivers.
Yeah, and on that defensive side of the ball with Oklahoma, just a quick sort of, I don't know, getting into this defensively because it's been sort of a meme this year with the SEC giving up points. Joel Klatt said something, and our Oklahoma followers on Twitter, which are awesome, and we love going back and forth with them, have been on people all year who have previously said things about the Big 12 not playing defense, and as evidenced by high scores. And I'm going to say this one more time. We said after 28 or before the Alabama game, the Oklahoma-Alabama game, we said 2018 Oklahoma offense was the best in college football history. A lot of it was because they can really run the ball, and people forget that about Oklahoma, but we'll get to that in a second. The frustrating thing is we've also maintained that it's good defenses are still going to give up good points to elite offenses. That we've never said that's not the case. The issue we've always had, especially in the Big 12, but we've seen it elsewhere, is when bad offenses are still putting up 30, 40, 50 points against teams that are at the top of the division. That is a really bad sign. And Oklahoma was that team for a while, especially in 2018. And it's one thing to give up 40, 50 points to Alabama. There's really no shame in that. It's when you give up 50 points to Texas Tech or give up 48 to Texas Tech with their backup quarterback. That's when there's a concern. This year, we haven't seen that. And Florida fans coming in thinking that their team is just going to rake because it's a Big 12 defense with really one of the best offenses in the country, which Florida has. I'm giving them a not so fast, and you're going to give me a number that sort of illustrates this, where Oklahoma is legitimately a better defense this year because they're not giving up the points to the bad offenses. We don't care if you give up points to good offenses. That's where you show the difference. I want you to take us through the FEI numbers, 2018, 2019, 2020, to show that progression and kind of put this into perspective.
So 2018 Oklahoma, for a high-level team, is probably the worst FEI defensive rating I've ever seen. They were 104th in the country, negative 0.61. Hard to say, but just basically worse than an average G5 defense. 2019, that improved significantly, but it was still bad. 69th in the country, negative 0.21. Again, below average, a little less below average, but still a below average defense. 2020, completely different deal. Oklahoma is now 14th in the country in FEI, 16th in the country in FEI defense, 0.62. So as much as they were below average in 2018, they're about as much above average this year. As bad as they were in 2018, they are that much better than average in 2020. And to go from 104th in the country to 16th, that's precipitous to say the least. So I do think Oklahoma should be considered a good defense. I think anybody that's looking at them based off how they were the past couple of years is mistaken. And like you said, 13 points to Oklahoma State. And granted, the starting quarterback went out. There's a lot more to that. But, 9 points to Kansas, 28 points to Texas Tech, 14 points to TCU. Yeah, some of these teams weren't great offensively. But if you look back at 2018, and I think this is your point, that didn't happen a lot. I mean, they gave up 40 points to Kansas in 2018. And that was always our problem. It's like, look, we understand that when you play really good offenses, you're going to give up points sometimes. But we're really troubled when you play bad or mediocre offenses and you still give up 40 plus. And this Oklahoma team just isn't doing that. And I think I want to, I'm going to walk into one more stat here. And I don't know if this is where you want to go with the discussion, but I'm going to force it there anyway. Something to bear in mind in this game with between two high-power offenses, these are two high-power pass rushing teams. Oklahoma is 4th in the country with 36 sacks. Florida is 8th in the country with 33 sacks. Respectively, these are the top pass rushing units in the Big 12 and the SEC numerically. So I think something to bear in mind with both these passing teams is, one, I think there is a, for all the defensive issues that they may or may not have, and they've given up points in games, they get to the passer, one. And two, because they get to the passer, I think you have to be a little concerned with the run game. So I'm kind of curious what your two thoughts are on those issues.
Yeah, and one of the things that you've said in the past, and I agree with, is, when you go into a game where you have two very high-powered offenses, or where you have to face a high-powered offense, you would rather have the explosive defense, the disruptive defense that can get to the quarterback, than, say, the Notre Dame defense. That's super disciplined, super fundamental. They're good, not great anywhere, and they can do the bend but don't break thing, but they're never going to put any pressure on the quarterback, because if you've got an offense that's going to put up points, really all you need are a couple of short fields or a couple of quick change situations that can completely change the game. And we saw this with Alabama versus Florida. Florida fans can attest to this. They were just a little bit better defensively, and that was the difference in the whole game. And it was through getting a couple sacks, getting some negative plays, that sort of thing. The running game is interesting to me because, a lot of people who don't know a whole lot about Oklahoma offensively, Oklahoma fans know this. Florida fans may not. Lincoln Riley has had tremendous quarterbacks at Oklahoma, but Lincoln Riley's offense can run the ball and is most successful when it does run the ball. And that's why I think we've seen a step back this year. They haven't been as good of a running team. And I know you're going to come at me with the Stevenson talk. We've got some numbers. We may not get into it. We don't have time to get into it. But he hasn't elevated that run game to a level that is vintage Lincoln Riley offenses, especially 2018. I think this is a good opportunity for us to get into the model and talk off of that. So why don't you just talk us into the model, especially with a little bit of the caveat of how we don't have the data this year, and just get us rolling on that to give us a bird's eye view of these two teams.
Our model is designed to be a solid baseline. Essentially, if both teams play their B-plus game, what does that average game look like? And it's based off the idea that you have a performance in each game that's relative to your opponent and what they're good at, that performance relative to opponents' expectations sort of defines how good your team is or is not in certain areas. And then if you use those expectations and how you've met, failed, or exceeded them and apply them to this opponent, you can get a picture of production. And then based on that production, we look at how you did in your games this season, and we let the computer self-learn a scoring model based off what it took for you to be successful and where your even and breaking points were. It's not just like a points per yard kind of deal. But one thing that we don't take into account is really factors that can't be reflected through pure stats this year. We don't bring in recruiting rankings. We don't bring in prior years. We don't bring in injuries or opt-outs. And the reason for that is philosophical. We're trying to say, okay, in this season, what have you looked like and where does it go? Our concern is no SEC team played a single out-of-conference game. So our stats for SEC teams are completely isolated from the rest of the country. That doesn't necessarily mean they're good. It could mean they're bad. But, that's just totally in, the eye of the beholder. But it does mean that statistically, what you're going to get out of our model is assuming the Big 12 and the SEC are more or less exactly the same on average and how you've played in that conference. This one, it's less interesting. There's some other ones where I think it's kind of interesting how that plays out. But anyway, Florida is a, pass-first team. Oklahoma's a pass-first team. Both are averaging about 4 yards a carry. One of the intermediate statistics we generate is a percentage of opponent averages allowed. Basically, if you allow 4 yards per carry, your opponent's average 5, you're allowing 80% of their opponent's expected reduction. Florida is 92% run, 97% pass. Those are merely solid numbers. They're not bad. I think there's this, conception this year that Florida is a bad defense. These numbers are relative to 100% being the SEC average because there is no out-of-conference play. 92% and 97% says it's just slightly above average, but it is actually a slightly above average SEC defense. Oklahoma, 71% against the run, 98% against the pass. That's not shocking. We talk about a lot. It's much easier to hold teams below their rush averages than their passing averages. It's why passing teams tend to do well at the end of the season, and particularly at this point, because passing games carry and are rarely slowed down. Run games can be shut down by high-end defense. The result of all this is effectively you have two teams that are going to pass well and neither one's going to run well. Florida's run game is expected to get about 2.9 yards per carry. That's not shocking. Alabama held them to under 2.1 yard per carry in that game. They make all their hay throwing the football. Oklahoma is a little bit more balanced, but we usually say about 4.5 yards per carry is the point where an offense is being successful on the ground. 3.8 yards per carry isn't going to cut it for Oklahoma. It's enough to give a threat, but not enough to move the ball. But anything over 8.5 yards per carry is a functional passing game. The result of that, it edges a little bit Florida because these teams are pass heavy. Florida has a significant edge in the air just because really their starting point is higher. The model thinks it's about 6.9 to about 6.2 yards per play, or about 40 to 38. And one thing I'll note before I flip it back to you, you talk about the run game. Our model does take into account play tendency for the given teams when it gets an expectation of performance in a game, right? It doesn't just say take half the run, half the pass. In the past, Oklahoma is or has been a run-heavy team. And as much as they're thought of a high-powered offense, they were 50% more run than pass last year. They were about 25% more run than pass in 2018. This year, they were almost totally balanced, maybe about 10% more run than pass. But I think that's the biggest thing in the model is seeing really is Oklahoma is a more balanced offense, but half that balance is a run game that's not particularly effective. And that's what gives the minor, 2 to 3 point edge.
I'm going to go ahead and give my score prediction here, and it's interesting because I do think Oklahoma's a better run team than Florida, but I think some of Florida not being able to run the ball is by design. That they may have the personnel to be able to run the ball, but they are playing the passing is far more efficient than running thing. But I think in a game like this, you got to be able to run the ball, and I'm not sure that they can. And I hate that Kyle Pitts is out. I just it hurts me. And then I think they had another opt out today on the defensive side of the ball. Florida did. I think Kyle Pitts is worth about 10 points in a game, and I know that outside of quarterback, that's kind of ridiculous to say, but Oklahoma fans, you'll see this when he gets to the NFL. And I'm going to go maybe a little lower scoring than people would think with these two teams in terms of brand name and how they've at least perceived to play defense. Give me Oklahoma 37, Florida 34. And Florida fans, I apologize in advance. If y'all win this game, it's just going to be another one that I got wrong. When I pick you to win, you lose. When I pick you to lose, you win. So I have this is 2 years now that I really haven't been able to peg Florida one way or the other. We did both predict him to win the SEC East this year in August and got killed by Georgia fans. We were right on that one. Give me your score prediction and walk me through your thoughts on this game.
I would take Florida 41-37. I don't have a strong read, and sometimes people don't get this. Our goal more than anything is to get an idea of the flow of the game, give you an idea of where the point margins are and where the advantages are. One of the concerns I have is Florida is likely to have at least one more opt-out just based off comments that Mullins made saying that there's some other guys considering it. I think with Tony in the fold, Florida is going to be able to move the ball through the air. If Tony or more guys start opting out, then that dynamic changes drastically. Copeland and Grimes are good receivers, but they're clearly what makes Florida so effective is you have guys like Copeland and Grimes that are your third and fourth options. That's a massive luxury most teams don't have. And I think that's what's made them so devastating offensively this year. Once those guys start going away, and we saw this in the LSU game, it really changes the dynamics for the reasons we talked about, that you don't have to put as many players on the field to defend them. And I do think there's the potential for a lower scoring game. I think this is going to be a high havoc game, personally. I think you're going to see a lot of points scored in rapid succession, lots of explosive plays. I actually think there could be more punting than people maybe expect. But I think drives are either going to, live or die quickly, right? That teams are going to see, either like a 5-play scoring drive or a 4-play and out situation. But to me, at the end of the day, Florida's receivers are just a little bit better right now, frankly. And Oklahoma is going to get there, but they're not there yet. Hazelwood wasn't available for much of the year. There were a lot of guys in and out of the lineup. But if you want to talk about guys like Mims and Rambo and Weiss, there's a lot of potential there that hasn't quite made it on the field. Florida has a number of guys that are very well seasoned, that are very productive, and as long as they're on the field, I think that gives Florida a little bit of an edge. But I do think, you talked about a low-scoring game, and I almost went that way. I do think people are underestimating that these are the two best pass-rushing teams in their respective leagues, and I really expect this to be a herky-jerky game. I think it's just going to be herky-jerky with a lot of explosive plays. It could easily be herky-jerky with a lot of turnovers and ugliness. But to me, it's a fascinating game because I think this is the hardest game actually to peg how it's going to go in terms of game flow. And it's the most likely one, whether or not I get against the spread right, the most likely one that I have wrong philosophically of the bowl season, I think.
And I think you're right. I mean, we're basically the same game, except you're giving Florida another touchdown. And that's we're in a game where it could go either way. Fans are going to come back and say, well, you need to eat crow if whoever of us got it wrong. And I'm going to tell you, like right now, we're saying either team can win this game. I mean, nobody's going to be shocked here. This is bowl season in general, and the playoffs are going to be really hard to pick because of conference isolation. And frankly, because the LSU game gave us a lot of question marks about Florida. Even though they played great against Alabama, they killed Georgia. There's still question marks there about which team is going to show up because they have the capability, as we've seen, to be a playoff team. Oklahoma has played better down the stretch. It's still hard to know. Like, on one hand, they're not losing these games. They're beating these teams, but on the other hand, they're beating bad teams. Oklahoma State's not a great team, but if you kill not a great team, that's good. So it's really hard to pick. This outside of the playoffs, this is probably my most interesting game that I want to watch the most. But I'll watch them all because, unlike a lot of people, I don't think we need to expand the playoffs. I think we just need to enjoy the football that we get. That's another topic for another day. All right, y'all, that's it on Florida and Oklahoma. Let us know your score prediction in the comments. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.